On this super review, let's take a look at the QDC Uranus. That's what we're gonna go with. So about a year ago, by popular demand, I reviewed the QDC Neptune, which was a $230 IEM from the company QDC. And when I reviewed it, it was sort of QDC's entry-level model. Even though it's not that cheap, it was around $230. QDC is just kind of known for making some pretty expensive IEMs. Well, here they've got another model, and I don't know if this is a replacement for the Neptune, but it seems to be. So what we've got here is the Uranus, and it is a $220 model, so it's actually 10 bucks cheaper than the Neptune, but it's got one more driver. So the Neptune was a single balanced armature driver earphone, and here what we've got is a single BA plus a dynamic driver. And I'm pretty interested to see what they can do with that, because just with that single BA, I thought that the Neptune had actually pretty nice tonality, maybe sounded a little bit flat in 2D like a single BAs tend to, but look, that's even true of much more expensive single BA IEMs. Here, QDC's, they've gone hybrid, they've gone multi-driver, and I'm actually pretty interested to see how they've done. So let's go ahead and open up the box. We'll find out what we get inside with the QDC Uranus, and then I'll spend some time living with this IEM, and I'll come back and I'll let you know, how does this thing compare to the Neptune, and how does it compare to some other $200, $250 IEMs? All right, so I've spent actually a number of weeks living with the QDC Uranus and comparing these things to the Neptune, as well as some other IEMs that I think are comparable, at least in price. And I'm ready to let you know what I think about this earphone. And overall, I'm just gonna go ahead and say, I think this is a pretty decent earphone, but it's not my favorite at the price. But we'll get into that. And let's just start by talking about the build of the QDC Uranus, which, if I'm perfectly honest, is probably one of my favorite aspects of this earphone. And a lot of it is just carried over from the QDC Neptune, which I actually really like the build of that. Although, and I'll save that although. So the construction is a basic plastic shell, but it's a really nice plastic shell. Like, there are some other plastic shells out there that are
Clearly cheaper built than these things are, and these things I think are just, they're just really attractive to look at. The plastic is super clear on the inside. I'll show you a close-up so you can actually see that. But yeah, the plastic is super clear on the inside, and then the outside there's sort of like a panel with a bit of a pattern baked into it. And interestingly here with the Uranus, they've actually gone with two different colors for the shells. So you've got purple on the right and blue on the left, which mostly mimics sort of like the left, right, blue, red motif that you see with other earphones. Just here it's a little bit more space themed. So yeah, that's cool. Though I do think that versus the Neptune, I actually prefer the aesthetic of the Neptune. Part of it, I think, is the color. I just think the bright, vibrant blue on the Neptune is a little bit more attractive than the colors that they've chosen here with the Uranus as well. I think that the outer plate on the Neptune, it's just like a more traditional tortoise shell sort of design, and I don't know, maybe I'm old school, but I like that better. The other thing that is not my favorite here on the Neptune, if I'm getting really picky, is so you've got some branding on both the left and the right buds, and it's not symmetrical, which I'm fine with. Over here on the right bud, you've got the brand QDC, and over here on the left bud, you've got the same QDC brand, but then you've also got the word Uranus. But curiously, the word Uranus is upside down, and I mean, who's to say which side is right side up and which side is upside down when a thing goes into your ear kind of sideways like this? But, well, they've got the QDC logo pointed one way, so I kind of assume that's right way up. I don't know, just being picky, but there you go. Another thing to call out with the build is just the shape of these shells. It's a very opinionated shape, and basically what I mean by that is it's molded for a particular shape of inner ear, and if your inner ear is shaped like this, there's gonna be a lot of benefits from that, right? So it's gonna fit very securely, and it's going to do an above average job of blocking out sound, which in my ears, it does that. The only thing that's worth considering is that if your inner ear shape isn't exactly like this, it can be a little bit uncomfortable. And in fact, in my ear, it's slightly uncomfortable. It takes up a lot of space. It's fairly large in my ear, and it's not the best sleeping I am because of that. But despite that, I didn't actually have any real issues with long-term listening sessions like I did with the Neptune. So the Neptune shell is very, very similar, also a very opinionated shape. But I had more issues with the Neptune causing a pressure point sort of right here on my ear, whereas with the Uranus, I didn't. So I have no idea whether or not that's going to be applicable to you, but something worth considering. Apart from the shells, other comments that we can make on the build is, well, there's the cable, of course. And this cable is basically the exact same cable that came with the Neptune, which is a pretty solid cable. It's not like especially plush or anything for the price, but it is a very well done cable, very well behaved. You've got obviously your preformed ear hooks up here at the top. You've got a functional chin slider, chin cinch, and then the hardware that you get down here at the Y split as well as at the 3.5 millimeter connector is actually surprisingly, it's well done. Like it's simple, but it's tasteful and it's unique. They've even got like the QDC logo kind of stamped into the connector in a way that I think looks really nice and gives these things a sense of quality that you don't get in most cheaper IEMs. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really have any complaints with the cable apart from the fact that it's just not especially like flashy or plush, but it is a good cable, behaves well, and I'm happy with it. One difference actually worth calling out between this cable and the Neptune cable is the Neptune came with an inline microphone. I don't have an inline mic here with the Uranus, and for me, I actually prefer that, so bonus points. All right, so that's the build and the fit and et cetera about this earphone. Let's go ahead and talk about the sound of this. And while a lot of the build has a lot of parallels with the Neptune, I think the sound tuning is actually more different than those other minor differences, all right? So what am I talking about? This is what I'm talking about. The Neptune I would describe as a fairly neutral, slightly upper mid-rangey IEM that I really like the tonality on, but again, I think I already talked about this, but the layering and the separation between the different sounds wasn't very well, it's not super prominent. And I just find that tends to be a thing that you get with a single balanced armature IEM. And here with the Uranus, we're no longer just dealing with a single balanced armature. I mean, you do just have one balanced armature, but you also have one dynamic driver. So we're working with a hybrid. And the one thing that I would expect from that is a little bit better, actually quite a bit better, layering and separation. And that's what I get. I do think that they've improved that quite a bit here with the Uranus. Dimensionality, the sense that instruments are all playing from distinct sort of places and sources versus just coming out of like one wall of sound. That's definitely improved here with the Uranus, and I'm a big fan of that. It does, in my opinion, make this a little bit more engaging to listen to. Now, the other difference that we get between this and the Neptune is not just in those sort of layering dynamics, but also in the tonality. And I gotta say, I'm actually not a big fan of the tonality change. I think that versus the Neptune, again, I kind of described it as neutral-ish with a little bit of a upper mid-range emphasis, maybe a slight mid-bass boxiness. The Uranus, I think, has got quite a bit of a warmer tilt to the sound signature. So that dynamic driver, it's delivering a more authoritative bass, which I think a lot of people are gonna appreciate. And generally in the sub-bass region, I prefer the sub-bass here for sure. It's just got a lot more impact, and again, that layering really comes across here. That's, you know, partly because there's multiple drivers here, but also just because that bass is being handled by a dynamic driver versus a balanced armature driver, and dynamics just seem to do bass better, in my opinion. I mean, that's not really my opinion, that's most people's opinion. Anyway, so the sub-bass aspect I actually quite like. It's got a nice punch again. Unfortunately, I don't know, in my opinion, it bleeds a little bit into the mid-bass. I feel like the mid-bass is a little bit too elevated for my tastes, and that bleeds into the lower mid-range. So overall, that aspect of it, like that elevated mid-bass and lower mid-range, gives this a warm tuning and almost kind of a boxy sound to it. So then the rest of the mid-range is fairly even. There's, you know, some upper mid-range lift, but not a big upper mid-range lift. I would say that versus the Neptune, there seems to be less upper mid-range lift here, and maybe that's just because of, well, whatever. That's my impression. And then you get into the treble region, and they feel like they're pretty similarly tuned, although there does seem to be a bit of a mid-treble spike here, which for the most part, it's not problematic. I think that it does contribute to some of that sense of layering and stuff, so I'm not mad at it. But there are times where it can come across a little bit sharp and a little bit one note. Unfortunately, I would, you know, personally, if I were tuning this IEM, and you shouldn't ever ask me to tune an IEM, but if I were tuning this IEM, I would probably lower that mid-treble spike and extend the treble a little bit more to give it a little bit more sense of air, because as it is, there's not a ton of air to the sound signature. I think that overall, look, it's a pretty fun listen. It's just tuned a little bit warm and boxy for my tastes. When I'm listening to music that I'm really deeply familiar with, I'm kind of let down by the tonality here. But if I'm perfectly honest, when I'm listening to music that I'm not super deeply familiar with, and I've been listening to some newer stuff right now, like I've been listening to the Marias and the latest Purity Ring album. Those are things that I'm not super familiar with because they're brand new to me. And when I listen to them on here, they're actually very, very satisfying. So for the most part, I do quite like listening to this earphone. It's just when I compare it to other earphones against my music library that I'm more familiar with, where that boxy tonality kind of really stands out. So I did already compare these things sonically to the QDC Neptune, but also worth calling out some other IEMs in this price range that you might want to consider. So there is the Eco OH10, which has actually got, I think, the same driver configuration. It's got a single balanced armature and a dynamic driver. And I think directly versus the QDC Neptune, I personally much prefer the sound tuning of the Eco. I think the Eco OH10, it's got a little bit more of a traditional sort of V-shaped sound signature. I think that the bass is definitely more focused in the sub-bass region on the OH10, whereas here again, the bass emphasis tends to bleed a little bit into the mid-bass and the lower mid-range. And then I think also the Eco OH10 just does a little bit better, quite a bit better with the extended treble frequencies, where it just gives it a sense of air that contributes to, I think, a better sense of that staging and separation and layering in the different sounds. I think also the OH10s don't have any of that mid-treble spike that these things do, and so because of that, they're actually a more relaxing listen, despite the fact that this is kind of tuned warm. I just find that the OH10 is a lot more comfortable to listen to for long distances. For long periods of time. And then maybe one other comparison worth making is with the JVC FDX1, which I like quite a bit. And I'll just say, spoiler straight up, I think the FDX1 is a much better sounding earphone than the Uranus. And maybe that's not totally fair, because I think the FDX1 is probably my favorite sounding IEM. It's just that here at, what, $220, these things are pretty closely priced with the FDX1. The only problem is I don't know that you can actually buy the FDX1 anymore unless you bother drop about it. So maybe you don't have the choice, but if you do have the choice, personally, I would go with the JVC. It's just got a more neutral sound signature. Again, the bass is more centered, more isolated to the sub-bass frequencies, and it's definitely less elevated than the bass that you get here with the Uranus. And mostly, it just comes across as a cleaner, clearer, just a better sound overall, where again, this kind of comes across a little bit boxy. And though I do enjoy listening to this and head-to-head comparisons with things that are priced similarly, it's not my favorite. So out of 5 stars, I'll go ahead and give the QDC Uranus a solid 3 stars. And that's, I would say, a solid 3 stars. And if you're following my rating scale, there is a difference between it's a 3 stars and it's a solid 3 stars. I think that this is a pretty nice earphone. Again, like the build and the aesthetic of it, I think is actually quite nice. Maybe not quite as nice as the Neptune, but I think it's quite nice. The fit, if it fits your ear, I think you're gonna really like the fit of these things, especially like versus, that's actually one advantage that I would give these things versus the JVCs, is that these things just plug and play a lot more easily than the JVCs. Cable's nice, so yeah, overall pretty happy with the build. And then the tuning, it's a more engaging listen, in my opinion, than the Neptune. But tonally wise, I actually prefer the tuning of the Neptune, and frankly, I prefer the tuning of a couple of other IEMs in this price range. So it wouldn't be my first choice, but I don't think it would be my last. If you're interested in checking out the QDC Uranus, of course, I've got links in the description down below, and while you're down there looking for that link, if you want to, if you like the video, you can hit the like button. You can subscribe to the channel, and then I'll see you on the next super review. That was corny.